Well, hello everybody. I am very, very glad to be here with you all, and I'm very honored by the invitation. I just want to let everybody know that as English is not my first language, you might experience some grammatical discomfort sometimes with me speaking, possibly, but I will do my best. And if you don't understand something, please let me know and I will correct myself. So, um, well, I have my undergrad in social science, so I came to the psychology counseling masters with some background in social studies, and I'm very interested in the intersectionality between social science studies and psychology studies. And the program I'm studying in is pretty much concerned about how the social net, the social tissue, is very influential in personal internal development. So today I would be talking about this from the perspective, the Sarkarian perspective of psychoeconomy, and bringing to the ultimate development of liberation psychology that I consider is somatic abolitionism, but talking also about other forms of resistance to neo-colonialism that were appearing throughout the 20th century. And yeah, so I have some very interesting human beings, friends here to dialogue with us, and they are Prabhat Ranjan Sarkar, Franz Fanon, Paulo Freire, Malidomar Somé, Martin Baró, and Rasma Menaken. And I consider that probably can be repetitive for most of you, anything about Prout, but it's important to introduce the concepts to be able to create a good reflection and connection. So I want to name that Sarkar was very accurate and with a sharp mind when he was creating the convergency between spirituality, um, philosophy, and socioeconomic fields. And that is what he called Prout, the progressive utilization theory, the neo-humanism, that is universalism to confirm a society based not in race, not in species, but basically in consciousness that is shared amongst all creation. And biopsychology, that is the understanding of the parallel between body and mind on the process of internal and collective evolution from matter to immaterial world to spirit. And when he's shaping Prout theory, he brings this very fundamental idea of the quadri-dimensional economy. And basically, the quadri-dimensional economy is a challenging perspective on how to organize economy. And this difference is mainly because uh, classic economists, they tend to. May I make it bigger? I see some people having trouble to read what is written. Okay, here we go. I'm so sorry for that, everybody. So as the main point for Prout is the decentralization of the economic planning. The economic structure should reflect that, and Sarkar framed the economic structure in what he called people's economy, that is the direct part of the economy dealing with creating the minimal 5 minimum requirements for life, and general economy, that is the general planning of economy, resource management, commercial economy, that is most of what we have, most of the studies nowadays in economics about market, commerce, trade, and psychoeconomy. And what interested me more to give a presentation about it is because I heard many times from different Proutists, experienced Proutists inclusive, about psychoeconomy being something that is not developed yet. It's something that the future will show the path about what is to implement psychoeconomy. And some people I heard saying that psychoeconomy is about creating mechanisms of market to convince people subconsciously how to change their practices from unsustainable or oppressive to sustainable and non-oppressive. And those mechanisms, market mechanisms, could be basically propaganda, the way this Proutist was framing it. And this poked me. I wasn't so comfortable with that definition of a mystical psychoeconomy, of something that will appear in the future, or something totally aligned with current market practices. And that presentation is about it. So the first thing is what Sarkar is calling psychic. What is the psyche for Sarkar? And he basically have all the biopsychology theory, where he frames a contemporary, a modern perspective on the ancient yogic tradition of understanding the chakras and the vrittis, the mental propensities of human beings, and how having some mental discipline and some body discipline can help someone to emancipate from their inner imprisonments, their own, what he called sanskaras, or their reactive momentum. So he translates the idea of vrittis and chakras in the idea of glands and subglands, and that's pretty much aligned with contemporary somatic studies and psychoneuroimmunoendocrinology, that are those studies are basically bringing together the ideas of epigenetics, that we are able to activate genes according to the environment we are, the environmental context we are in. And the idea of neuroplasticity, that is our brain doesn't get stuck when we achieve certain age of development, but our brain is always able, according to how we are utilizing it, to grow or degrow accordingly to our practices. So basically, Sarkar was being very generous in bringing a more comprehensive approach toward chakras that is relatable with contemporary science. And I guess most important of that part of the presentation is he was mentioning that the process of psychospiritual and spiritual growth and liberation, that he often called sadhana in his spiritual scriptures, discourses. This meditation, also called, and I quote, should be performed knowing fully well the location of different glands and subglands, and also the different cells in the human brain. And people should not only know the location of these glands and subglands, they should also be acquainted with their respective systems of hormone secretion. Otherwise, their meditation will not produce any fruit. So, for the system of meditation, knowledge or of biology is essential. Human beings have yet to invent the way of methodical thinking and methodical meditation based on the location of different concerned cells, glands, and subglands, and their secretion of the requisite quantity of hormones. So, even if Sarkar was a spiritual master, was a guru that gave a specific meditation spiritual techniques, he was saying here that we still need to invent those methodologies. That mean that it's not an hermetic system that is given by scriptures or by a spiritual authority, as he was. He's saying human beings should use their intelligence and intuition to do so. And this is not something that Sarkar specifically mentioned, but nowadays my understanding is that samskaras, what he called samskaras, these reactive momentums, they are very similar with what nowadays trauma-informed psychologists call trauma. So in psychology, traumas are the not processed information from previous experiences. So experiences that create some pattern and stuckness in their minds. And it's pretty similar to the concept of sanskaras, even if the current mainstream psychology doesn't mention so much about rebirth, past lives, or etc. There is some research being done about it by some institutions. I can mention the DOPS in the University of Virginia, for example, but it's not something established for contemporary science. But with that understanding of biopsychology, of psyche as something that is present in the body and the mind, when we are talking about psychoeconomy, it's helpful because according to Sarkar, psychoeconomy is divided in two main branches. One of the branches is the countering exploitation branch, and the other one is the psycho-spiritual branch. So Sarkar mentioned that the most urgent part of psychoeconomy is having people fighting against exploitation or to recover their threatened culture. Hey, Sparky. Sorry. Just a dog with his sanskara of being a dog. So this first branch, Sarkar mentioned that is should be responsible to fight against pseudo culture and consumerism, expose fear-based narratives and dogma, challenge linguistic and cultural suppression, oppression, repression, and promote critical thinking and intellectual awakening. So basically, the first part of the process in the psychoeconomy is strengthening movements that are protecting local native culture. And native, we can understand a broad field of examples, not only the caricat like idea of native as indigenous that live in a reservoir, but almost all the oppressed cultures in the world. The second branch is what he called the psycho-spiritual in psychoeconomics, that are mostly about cultivating positive sentiments, promoting spiritual practices, developing intuition in inner wisdom, and achieving self-realization. So the process of emancipation starts with acknowledging that each person and community and society need to have their own language, their own identity and style respected and nourished in order for people to be able to express themselves and sit in their place, in their position in the world. And with that guaranteed, because that is not guaranteed nowadays, people can go inner, go deeper inside themselves and find their ultimate identity, that it is with consciousness, the universal identity. Well, the psychoeconomic exploitation happens through creating artificial demands, what I mentioned, pseudo culture, creating, instilling dogma, controlling of information and education. And it's a cascade, I would say, from creating artificial demands, passing through those, suppression of language, promoting negative sentiments, and end up in economic exploitation. So there is this classic image of the Iberic colonizers from mercantilism, the Spanish and Portuguese, arriving in the land where I grew up, so my ancestors, unfortunately, and giving mirrors, giving guns to indigenous people that didn't need that. And at some point, the indigenous people got interested in those things and dependent on the Portuguese people that had those technologies. And from that emotional connection through these artificial demands, a door it was opened to the moment that they didn't have the right on their own land. And okay, all this process of exploitation brings us to think, okay, we need to fight against this exploitation. We need a revolution, we need transformation. And this transformation, how it happens. So I was recently in Portland, and I was having a meal with other Proutists, and one of them was asking, like, what do you consider is clash and cohesion in the social sphere? And before the other one respond, he said, because I don't think we should have use of strength against against oppression. And I was surprised by that affirmation, because Prout doesn't deny the need of use of strength. And the problem is, as Prout have a very strong spiritual component, it's easy for people to tend to understand the need of only positive sentiments towards the goal that is a universal family, a universal society. But Sarkar doesn't say anything in that direction. Actually, Sarkar mentions that negative sentiments, they are necessary, they are important in the process of building positive sentiments. Basically, on the biopsychological understanding of human mind, according to Sarkar, we have what he called static rage, for example, and subtle rage. Static rage is when someone is consumed by rage, and rage becomes the goal of their actions, while subtle rage is the strong stamina and energy towards facing an external static force, oppressive force. So to the rest of the presentation, it's very important to establish the role of negative sentiments in the process of bringing positive sentiments. And I will just go a little bit faster than I prepared, because it's a huge topic. Actually, I would like to talk more, but basically, in order to develop the society from a psychoeconomic influence towards liberation, emancipation in individual and collective spheres, we need to work building identity and then giving direction from narrow sentiments towards universal sentiments, and in that process bringing context for material autonomy, and then from that to mental and spiritual autonomy, emancipation. And there is, for example, where Frantz Fanon, for example, arrives in our presentation. Fanon was a psychanalyst, Marxist, communist from Argely, close in his generation to Sartre, that probably most of you know, the existentialist philosopher.
Algeria.
Algeria, sorry, I mistranslated. Thank you. So from Algeria, and Fanon had this ability to bring a subjective approach and challenge the mainstream communist semantics towards revolution. So he was talking about, for sure, internationalization, that is the global revolution that Sarkar talks about, but he was bringing an approach that you should bring local, tribal liberation, this tribal liberation to regional to national, and national towards international liberation. And yeah, so he in the 50s, 40s, 50s, 60s, Fanon was talking about what Sarkar came to talk about in the 70s, 80s, actually, framing those ideas. And yeah, so one idea from Fanon, for example, was a little bit bloody. He was very military, just as Subhash Chandra Bose, for example, in the Prout world. But he was talking mostly about recollecting history, civilization, and existential value for the inferiorized populations from Africa. And Frantz Fanon was very key intellectual that brought the Black Panther Party from California, Oakland, California, United States. He was one of the main intellectuals utilized by the Black Panthers. And the Black Panthers, using his ideas, Fanon ideas, they created residential scholar food cooperatives for the local people. They were pretty much the seed of bringing African American spirituality as a core process of revolution that I guess nowadays they are more influential in, for example, Black Lives Matter movement. That is a very revolutionary movement that is already in the stage of passing from negative to positive sentiment. So took the Black Panthers 3-4 generations, 70, 50, 60, 70 years, but they are nowadays pretty much aligned with towards a more universalist perspective of revolution. In Brazil, we have Paulo Freire with the pedagogy of the oppressed, and then the pedagogy of autonomy and the pedagogy of liberation. Some parts of his scriptures talks about. And he also came from a Catholic Marxist words perspectives, and he brought some critical thinking about the dialectics method, putting a more subjective approach on the dialectics method from Karl Marx. And Paulo Freire was basically extremely hopeful of the ability of any human being to liberate themselves according to their own experiences, their own background. So he with Fanon were two key intellectuals to create what we will see soon, that is the liberation psychology. And because they were saying like all the potentiality to emancipate your soul, not only your economic level, but your mind, it's inside of you. And that's extremely poetic and beautiful, and bring Marxism closer to what Prout is defending and fighting for in society. And what is interesting in Paulo Freire is that he was working close to the Catholic Church in the ecclesiastic community. Dada, you know how to translate it? Comunidades eclesiais de base?
Grassroots-based grassroots Catholic communities, basically.
Ecclesiastic community. So thank you very much. he was fundamental to the grassroots movement from the Catholic Church that was key against the dictatorship implemented by some international neoliberal agenda in Brazil on the 60s, 70s, 80s. And they were working on the education to emancipation with the landless workers movement in Brazil. So Paulo Freire was instrumental to create this movement that nowadays is a movement with the larger agroecological organic production of food in Brazil. They have around 6-7 million people in this movement, and they have universities, schools, cooperatives, credit cooperatives. They have now, for the last years, they have a partnership with Mondragon from Spain, that is one of the most established and acknowledged cooperative federations that I know about, like Mondragon, France, and Japan. Systems are very developed. And Mondragon is working with MST, that was very influenced by Paulo Freire. And MST, this landless workers movement, is all about regionalism, and they have uh, um, a very liberatory approach in their revolutionary process. Another person that I could not avoid to talk about is Malidoma Somé from Burkina Faso. That Burkina Faso is nowadays passing through a very revolutionary process with Ibrahim Traoré. I don't know if you are reading about it. It's a strong spiritual revolutionary leadership in Burkina Faso. And Malidoma Somé was pretty much emphasizing that the psychological process of liberation and the communitary process of liberation is not only about giving material conditions, but about fighting for your own notion, idea of time, of length of life. So what are the rituals that one and another society are fundamented in, and how we reabsorb those rituals to become farther from the capitalist materialistic way of living. And he and Ignacio Martin Baró with liberation psychology, I bring them because they bring to more subtle levels the idea of liberation. So I understand them as a bridge from counter exploitation psychoeconomy to internal liberation psychoeconomy. So because Malidoma Somé, just as Ignacio Martin Baró, through different ways, Malidoma Somé through acknowledging and giving centrality and importance to traditional spiritual practices of each place. Ignacio Martin Baró is talking about creating a community of psychologists as a social movement to bring inner emancipation while bringing social emancipation. So psychology as a profession is structurally established in society as something liberatory, anti-oppressive. And I'm almost there, so we can have some time to talk about some of this stuff. Resma Menakem, it's a very interesting colleague of my wife that is a social worker. Resma Menakem, he created somatic abolitionism, that is basically his theory is basically introducing mindfulness and meditative contemplative practices to on the therapeutic process and adapting them to each culture. So the idea of somatic abolitionism from his perspective, because his body and his experience is of a black man from the United States, was created focused in black population, but he was talking about the white populations that came from Europe and were oppressed from the nobility from Europe during the 16th, 17th centuries, 18th centuries. And these oppressed white people, he acknowledged, was very comfortable oppressing indigenous and black people because the pain of their oppression were very softened by having someone inferior to them on the system, on the capitalist system. So he focused on black population, but he works with white people also. He have a beautiful work with the police force from Minneapolis, and he works with white people, he works with black people, he works with any population that present to him. What signalize a universalist approach, understanding of society. If you read his book, My Grandmother's Hands, his he's pretty much framing an universalistic understanding. And he also, because he have a somatic approach, he has some interesting understandings that are similar to what we called samskaras, reactive momentums, negative and positive. He have a concept of clean pain and dirty pain. And he never read about biopsychology, I believe, from Sarkar, but he's talking about this more pleasant or unpleasant sanskaras. And I guess that's a very interesting approach. And he's bringing these somatic practices and ethical discussions. His methodology is based on discussing and developing ethics while doing also somatic practices. And he mentioned yoga, dance, mainly traditional local native dances, as ways of performing this somatic abolitionism. Oops, wrong. Oh, that's it. And yeah, and he talks about individual practices and group practices, somatic liberatory practices, and trainings. He gives trainings to government, police, school staff. So I guess this is pretty much what Sarkar was talking about when he mentioned psychoeconomy. And so after reflecting about those and many other examples that I could bring today, but only those that we saw in these last minutes, I guess all those practices, they are into the field of psychoeconomic practices, and they converge. They have a very strong convergency most of the time, even if it's not the same language, but the same methodology that I showed in the beginning of the presentation, that Sarkar, when Sarkar talks about creating a methodology of perceiving your own body and your glands, your subglands, even if there isn't a yogic perspective on how to doing it, most of them are talking about acknowledging and understanding your different feelings of inferiority, of rage, of hope, and knowing how to utilize those feelings towards your personal and collective liberation. Yeah, that's as a whole what I am trying to understand as an integral liberation model of psychology. That integral psychology is integrative psychology, is the model that is being accepted on very open-minded, spiritual-oriented, and revolutionary-oriented psychological practices. So if I have time after the questions that I guess we can have some now, I will share a little bit about the ontological turning in anthropology, that I guess is the most close perspective on universalism that we have nowadays in ontological creation, philosophical creation in the academia. I guess
that was a tour de force, covering an amazing group of people that you found inspiration in and sort of added to my book list. But at this time, I invite anyone that has a question for Arthur to raise your hand, or if you're more comfortable, just put it in the chat, and we'll have a discussion with him about it. Alex.
First of all, I want to thank Arthur so much for taking the time to be with us this evening and share what's obviously a passion of yours. This is like it feels to me, hearing this is like the peak of an iceberg coming out of the water, that most of the content you're only able to just skim the surface of. And we're constricted by time, but I heard elements of liberation psychology, of anti-exploitation, changing the dynamic of how we understand the psychic elements of our economy, but also there's a blending of where the economy may, I don't think there's a strong division of where the economy ends and social interactions begin. And I think that you are really, what I was hearing was you underscoring the social dynamics of the psychic economy. And I wish I could hear a bit more about somatic abolitionism, the concept of in part of trauma residing in bodies and nervous systems, and that in overcoming the psychologies of oppression is also identifying within ourselves these energies that we have within ourselves toward supremacy or towards trauma or towards ancestral challenges that we've inured from childhood and beyond. You just were able to hint at some of this stuff. Could you go on a little bit deeper, and so that we can hear the kind of the gravity of the depth of this field? Thank you, brother.
Well, thank you for your participation and your question. Yeah, if it was a presentation only about somatic abolitionism, I could prepare something just about it, but I thought it would be too bold to bring such a topic to a Prout panel, because it's not something that is particularly on the mouth of Proutists. But yeah, so when we are talking about somatic abolitionism, we are talking about psychoeconomic exploitation, basically, in neo-humanistic language, and about psychoeconomic liberation. And there are many examples that Resma, in his books that I read, the two books that I touched, one of them I read, the other one I just touched. Basically, he mentions, of course, the George Floyd case, that was the spark for the Black Lives Matter movement in 2020. So the reflection is about, okay, we're talking about structural racism, and we are talking about why subconsciously white bodies, they have a very very strong trigger against black bodies. And the example I utilize to talk about how white bodies, they were oppressed, and then he brings the ideas that I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation about, for example, epigenetics. I don't know how familiar everybody is with the idea of epigenetics, but basically epigenetics is in neuroscience is a discovery that challenges and expands a little bit the Darwinian idea of evolution by acknowledging that our DNA, the genes, the codes that we have in our DNA, they can be shrinked or exercised. They can be incentivized by our practices individually and by the environment, family, society we are in. So if we have in our body, caused by the environment, can be a microsystem or a mesosystem or a macro system. If we have, for example, shyness and inferiority poking us, challenging us all the time, like very present, it will be easy for people to develop more genes that will make more manifested shyness and inferiority complexes. And he brings that because white people in the United States, if they are not oligarchy and billionaires, if they are not the elite, they are probably in their neuromuscular system, they have a strong memory of being oppressed by centuries and centuries of generations by the elites of their ancestors in Europe, probably in the case. And as Paulo Freire brings in the pedagogy of autonomy, the dream of the oppressed is to become the oppressor. And Resma, with somatic abolitionism, he just absorbed that idea from Paulo Freire, and he utilized that idea talking about how white people tends to be oppressive in a racial structure that is oppressive from white to black, because there were some oppression from white to white, rich, wealthy white to poor white already in the system. And you have a cascade, a hierarchy of values, colors that is in flesh. it's in our genes, in our bones, muscles, neurons. So according to Resma, we need to find what are the values and symbols that strengthen our each one of our identities as human communities. So the indigenous, the different indigenous people, the different black people from each place, they need to rescue, to bring again the memory, identity from their ancestors. And this process of bringing language, bringing dance rituals, bringing religiosity from their ancestors will rise somatic practices that are helpful in abolishing this somatic oppression. So somatic abolitionism is pretty much about engaging in therapy individually and collectively in community, adopting practices, new practices, because there is no essentialism, cultural essentialism in according to Resma and anything in liberation psychology. I say cultural essentialism because in Brazil, and I believe here in the United States should happen something similar to that, but in Brazil, some white people, I would say some fascist white people, they tend to say that indigenous people are not anymore indigenous if they are wearing tennis shoes, cotton clothes, mobile. If they are playing football, they are accultured. I guess that's the word. That's a word in English. Accultured. Yeah. So there's not such thing. Human culture is universal. So indigenous doing meditation and doing yoga, just as any white people, it's completely normal because culture is something that we share. It's not something that we possess. And besides this idea of epigenetics, based on the intergenerational trauma that we are living. So the intergenerational samskara that we are submersed, we are immersed in. These somatic practices are pretty much about how we are making the usage of our minds towards understanding each one of the episodes, the traumas, and I will make this parallel with sanskaras, individual sanskaras, how we are reflecting, being able of reflecting how those sanskaras affected our nervous system in this lifetime. Because one thing is talking about how the environment is affecting our genes. The other thing is talking about how our response to external events, this trauma, is shaping our pattern of behaviors in this lifetime. So somatic abolitionism is talking about re-educating our mind to expand our self-identity, the identity of ourself, with something greater of the inferiorized self that we have because of systemic racism. And I could speak a little bit more or much more even, but I will also have pleasure in listening other questions. And I see Jim Powell with his hand raised, and we can talk more about it later, Alex.
Yeah, I just want to bring up an example of some of the things you're talking about with Malidoma Somé. He and when his wife at the time came to Madison, we did a weekend retreat with him.
Yeah.
And afterwards, he also,
No way, man.
Yeah.
Sorry, I want to know more about
I would be glad to talk to you more, but he he actually granted me time to he and his wife, and I talked about tantra psychology and the similar connection between some of the practices that my wife Sada and I do, and what they're doing. Particularly, you can almost put it in trance, dance, and music. But in the weekend workshop, there was he was brought by a local shaman, and he would talk about the somatic work was worked out through movement and dance, and people would get in touch. The connection was everybody has trauma. Even if you're a white person, you have some kind of trauma, and so done in this collective. He talked, as you mentioned, he talked about community rituals. So we would do these rituals, and we would always end up with movement and chant and dance, and so there was a very universal aspect to what he was doing, but it was working with the somatic, but also there's also the transcendent. And when we talked, it's like there was this real connection, because if you look at the science of sound and music and chant, it transcends the different cultures, but also we were honoring it in his particular cultural expression. So anyways, I could go on and on about him, but I just validating what you're talking about.
Jim, I am in love with what you're sharing, and I want to hear more about it for sure. If we can exchange contact later, I will love
Yes, I'd be glad. If we lose contact, John knows how to contact me.
Yeah.
So he can connect us if we lose that. But yes, I would love to talk to you more.
Nice. And yeah, that's exactly what I was talking about. Many therapists, those are some examples we have. For example, I was very ashamed because I didn't name any woman, so I'll do it now. We have this very interesting woman from North Carolina, very nearby Asheville. She's in Charlotte.
Mhm.
Oh my gosh, I forgot her name. Undrowned. No, no, no.
While you're thinking, I'll just say that Maladoma's wife, like Sabanfu, I think it was. She she was, in terms of a woman, I would say that she was more liberated, because she was a very powerful woman. So it was, even though he was sort of like the front leech, there was her spiritual, I would say her spiritual presence was very strong. She was not oppressed in her culture, but he was taken out of his culture and forced into a Catholic upbringing, and a Catholic, and very oppressed. And so he had more wounded, and she was more of a spiritual, more free to pursue her spirituality. And so she was also involved in the same work. If you maybe when we talk, I can let you know more about her work, and you can.
Very interesting. Yeah, I bet. From what he's sharing, his book is one of the most beautiful books I read in the last years, Ritual. And well, he mentioned a lot about it. I would love to hear. And this sister, Alexis Pauline Gumbs, she wrote a book recently called Undrowned. And it's basically about how observing marine mammals, she was talking about what are the marine mammals' practices towards uh, uh, facing their trauma from human beings. So she was talking with some biologists and observing, going to observatory of marine mammals and talking about how dolphins and whales, and she included even some sharks in the pot, even if they're not mammals, and the book is mainly about mammals, but how they are using some psychological strategies to go against trauma and healing themselves. And I was like, wow, such a interesting perception about our brother species, other mammals that are also collectively being able to copy with interspecies oppression. And yeah, so we have many examples, even outside of human species. And not only outside of tantric practices of biopsychology. So anyway, thank you for sharing and reminding me also. And Nirmala, I guess, also want to talk.
Yes, thank you so much. I wonder if you could speak a bit about ancestral roots versus cultural appropriation, because as you're speaking, I'm thinking of how often white people like myself borrow practices from elsewhere in the world, whether it's yoga from South Asia or dance rhythms that have their origin in Africa or Afro-Latin sources, or people learn Hawaiian massage, or we at least on a conscious level elevate these indigenous cultures. But if my own ancestry is part Russian and part Swedish and part English, do I have that same epigenetic need to go back to the dances of my Russian Jewish ancestors or my Irish or whatever, versus appropriating something that is another kind of almost somatic colonialism? I wonder if you have any thoughts about this.
I do. It's very sensitive content to share, but I will share. We are hearing not so many people, and I believe magnanimously that everybody will make a good use of what I share. But thank you for your question. Well, I guess the idea of cultural appropriation that you are bringing, I have two aspects of it. One is to acknowledge that it's completely necessary for people to preserve. So I guess for me comes to positive and negative sentiments. So in order to have some anti-oppressive internal process for some individuals and communities, creating a strong identity is crucial, it's important. To create this strong identity, you need to have some polarization, some dichotomization between us and them. What we are that is different from them, because this process of looking to your own identity is the process of de-identifying from the oppressive identity. So this is the them in that situation. And I observed, for example, that in Brazil we have the National Indigenous Network, Indigenous People Network, something like that. It would be the translation. And this network started just meeting amongst indigenous people, and slowly started to open to white people and other people. And basically, what I learned from it is there is naturally in an individual process of healing, in all the process with, for example, a therapist, you have the processes of transference and counter transference, where this individual will understand and identify what are the traumas he is living in, and understand and identify what are the identity of him or her. So this is one part, is the positive part of having a cultural appropriation lens understanding. The negative part is there is no such thing as cultural appropriation. Otherwise, you mentioned yoga and some contemporary stuff, but let's go back to language. At some point, some people saw other people making meaning of their noises, and by mimesis, that is the primary learning process of human beings, they started doing that also. So let's talk about paper, like paper sheet. Registering culture was something that was developed in Egypt or China. I already heard two different versions, but it was developed somewhere and it's useful for everybody. And we can talk about cotton. We can talk about as Prout was created from an indigenous Dravidic perspective. I will bring like, okay, what we have nowadays in this yogic Indian civilization. Okay, let's talk about Prabhat Sangeet and harmonium. So Prabhat Sangeet, the Sangeet culture created 7,000 years ago by Sadashiva, this Sangeet culture that nowadays utilizes harmonium to express itself. You know where it was created, harmonium? In France. And the Germanic people brought harmonium from France to India during the colonial process. And India is making a good use of it. It's beautiful music. So I guess there is this two parallel approaches, aspects of cultural appropriation that, in my understanding, are relevant. Probably there are more, but is the thing that I already reflected about it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Maybe if it's okay, I'll ask you one more question, and then we want to be sensitive to your time as well as other people, given our late start. But again, from the standpoint of epigenetics, I'm presuming, and maybe incorrectly conflating, some of the literature that's out about, kind of that genetic transfer of trauma, et cetera, that moms have it. It's embedded in their infants, and it was embedded in their mothers. So I wonder if one of the ways to identify that is, for any of us curious, is to try and go back to our childhood and remember some of the things we grew up hearing, because they could be an indicator of some of that trauma. And so maybe a productive way to sort of systematically try to identify what our respective trauma is and try to shift that, so that we don't sustain that in society. Am I on base with that, or what do you think?
Well, I guess what I understand so far, it's correct. So we have some samskara, because we are basically fully sanskara. Each individual is only composed by sanskara and consciousness. If you withdraw sanskara, consciousness, we are all the same. So those sanskaras, they come from ideas, concepts that are forced in our experience. And as you're saying, I understand this way also. If we are able to identify, understand our patterns, and track them to some source that is the original dogma or idea, as dogma in the Sarkarian language, we can be able to adopt, how Buddha said, adopt a opposite practice to help us balance our mental landscape. And yeah, I don't know if I completely agreed your question, but how I understood it, I completely understood your question, but I agreed with you, and that's what I would respond firsthand. Is it something that
Yeah, no, that helps, and it does get into the whole concept of there's different kinds of sanskaras, and so we're sort of a mix of those, and you're right, it's us.
Yeah, and those sanskaras, they are conformed by many times by dogmas, and having what in somatic abolitionism Rasmus Menakem called clean or dirty pain. Like, dogma causes a lot of dirty pain. Clean pain is like, let's make it softer so we can navigate with our consciousness towards the middle path, towards identifying with consciousness, not with something or the opposite of something, the negative of something.
Yeah.
And so let's fight against those dogmas, those narrow ideas of identity that our ancestors, our caregivers, parents, and community gave us, towards something that helps us to identify with what we are and with consciousness.
Well, I want to be sensitive to the time. So really want to thank you for what I think was just an absolutely amazing presentation. And I think many of us would welcome a encore, to maybe get into a little more detail on some of these things. So we appreciate that you tried to get through it given our late start. But I think it was a wonderful presentation. We sincerely thank you for taking the time. I know some of us have been in graduate school and we know the demands that can put on our time, energy, and effort. So thank you for taking the time and doing a fantastic presentation. And so at this point, I will say thank you. And
Thank
we
you.
wish you well in your studies and travels and whatever else you and your Brazilian at heart spouse engage in.
Thank you, John. Thank you, everybody. It was lovely to hear you, share with you. I'm really inspired by what I heard from you also. And I hope we can keep this dialogue.
Yeah, and I can try and connect you with Jim and maybe also with Doris.
Yeah, I loved, Nirmala's question. I became curious to know her background also. I think Proutists, psychologists have a lot to share with each other. I have a lot to learn, at least. I would love to hear experiences and thoughts. And I guess this can be very beneficial to Prout movement as we are more able to dialogue with liberatory movements that are framed on a similar, not in language, but in essence, a similar background.